State parks all across North America seem to have some creepy stuff happening in them. Whether it's people going missing, unsolved murders, or just creepy cryptid sightings, it seems everything under the sun happens there. These subscribers sent in their allegedly true, creepiest encounters in state parks. If you have a story you'd like to share in the channel, whether it be in a state park or something else, be sure to send it in to the website or the email that you can find in the description down below. I'd love to hear from you. Now, let's get into these really creepy stories that'll keep you up tonight. The following story involves a group of my friends and I backpacking in Yellow River State Park. 6 of us were backpacking in the late fall, when not many people were around, when we came across a couple of guys heading in the opposite direction. They informed us we shouldn't go into the valley, as they had spent the last couple of nights there and could hear people talking outside their tent at night, despite no one else being around. My friends and I laughed it off as we'd drunkenly been stargazing in the past, and didn't think much of the story. We eventually reached the valley and set up our tents. There were 2 of us per tent, and 3 of us had firearms on us. After setting up, we broke out the liquor and cards to play some games before calling it a night. By the end of the card games, one of our friends had passed out near the fire, and we decided that we'd leave him there putting the fire out, as they weren't getting up. Later that night, we were awoken to the sound of our friend screaming. "Who the hell was that?" Having no clue what he was on about, we all looked at him and realized someone had drawn on his face with ash from the fire. They'd drawn an upside-down cross on his forehead and a pentagram on his shirt. I'm not religious by any means, but I was pretty freaked out by this, that some random person came out of the woods and did that. I think that would freak out anybody, really. After returning to our tents, unable to sleep, we heard rustling in the woods around us. I believe it was about 3:30 in the morning when this happened. It was at this point we heard someone yelling,
"Give him to us! Give him to us! Give him to us!"
I freaked out and loaded a pistol, but my friend fired a round from his .22 into the air immediately. The sounds of people running away surrounded us all from all sides. The moment we had light, we left and also reported what happened to sheriffs, but they said they could do nothing but take a report. A lot of help they were. Be careful out in Yellow River State Park. When I was 24, I went to Newton Battlefield State Park in Elmira, New York with an ex-girlfriend of mine and one of her friends. We spent the day exploring and visiting all the signs that had information about how it had been a battle site in old wars, and had been visited by George Washington as well as other notable historical figures. I found it all quite fascinating, even though I wasn't much of a history buff myself. Anyway, the sun had set about an hour or 2 prior, and we settled into our cabin. Now, I will say we had beer and weed on us, but up to this point, we had only 1 beer each and were rolling up our first blunt. I say this so you know the intoxication wasn't a factor, as we were pretty straight at that point. It was dark along the pathway that we were walking, and we all had our backs to the cabin. I heard footsteps coming up the walkway, and quickly stashed the illegal leafy substance under my camping chair. As I put it away, and my ex and her friend both heard the steps as well, and looked in the direction of the walking noise, in the distance, light of the campfire, we saw a set of eyes. The noise soon walked past the right side of the cabin before continuing on past and eventually to the left side of the cabin, where it stopped on the side of the cabin we were sitting on. I felt we were busted as I hid the weed under the chair before I asked, "Is there anything I can help you with?" There was no reply, and all I could make out was the eyes glowing with the light of the fire. We grabbed the flashlight I had in my lap and turned it on. I went to point it at the eyes, but before I could beam it into the eyes, it turned away, as though it was going to continue on its path. When I finally arrived where this thing would be, there was nothing but the sound of walking continuing down the path. We spent the rest of our night in the cabin, too freaked out at what we saw and heard. I've only ever experienced 4 to 5 paranormal events in my life, and this is one that I question the most. After all, I wasn't alone in my experience this time. I am 29 years old and have been researching and investigating the paranormal since I had my first experience at the age of 9 in 1998. I'm an extremely realistic and logical person who is not easily excited over things that go bump in the night. I have seen and experienced some things in my life that most people have not. Some don't believe and some do believe, but that's okay because I'm not here to convince anyone of anything. I'm just here to share. My lights in the sky experience happened a few years ago in 2014. I was living in New York and went to Jones Beach State Park one fall night with a friend of mine. It was a chilly night, so we didn't plan on staying out too long, but it was nice to be able to walk along the boardwalk without dealing with the crowds of people. We soon stopped at the covered picnic area and to sit down and chat. The night was clear enough to see the stars, which can sometimes be difficult with all the light pollution on Long Island. We lost track of time with our conversations, and as we got up to leave, I had to glance up at the sky. I love the stars, and I noticed something odd. A very bright light had appeared over the horizon that wasn't there a moment ago. My friend, seeing that I was staring off into space, looked up and thankfully saw it as well. 2 initial thoughts crossed our minds. 1, it was an airplane, or 2, it was just another star. We watched it for a few solid minutes, but it never moved from where it sat, ruling out the possibility of it being an airplane. Side note, my boyfriend is an airplane pilot and I spend a lot of time watching airplanes. This definitely was not one. So a few moments go by when we notice a second light, just as bright as the first, appear seemingly out of nowhere. It manifested right below the first light and just hovered there. Naturally, we looked at one another perplexed. When we looked back up again, a third light was now appearing below the first 2. I don't know how long we stood there looking at these lights, but we did verbally discuss all the possibilities that might explain what they were. We tried very hard to be realistic in debunking this phenomenon. After a while, the lights shifted, taking a triangular pattern. Again, we stood mesmerized. They did not change positions again. After what felt like forever, we finally decided that we should leave as it was starting to get late. We started to walk away, assuming that when we looked back these lights would be gone. Interestingly enough though, they weren't. They stayed right up there in the sky in that triangular pattern for almost our entire walk back out to the car. Only when we reached the park exit did they disappear. We believe what we saw were UFOs, though I'm not 100% comfortable labeling it as alien per se. UFO does stand for Unidentified Flying Object, which is exactly what they were. It was just one of my many inexplicable experiences I've had thus far in life. I wish we had a definitive answer as to what we saw out there that night. My boyfriend and I headed to a state park near us. It's far enough out so there is no noise or light pollution, but it gets dead silent out there quite often. You have to drive a few miles out of town to get there, and it's nothing short of a desert and farmland. Once you pull in, you can choose whether to go to the left to the nearest park side or turn right and drive out to some more paths to the Bison to the farthest side. This was before the park turned public, so at the time, there was no curfew. It's a really cool park. It actually has trees and ponds. It's a quick getaway from life pretty much and is so quiet and the privacy is nice. We decided to go to the nearest side of the park, and we talked and walked around until it got dark. Once it was dark, we laid in the back of his truck, looking at the stars and made out. It was a beautiful summer night. It was 1 or 2 in the morning when we finally decided to leave. We made our way out of the park slowly. We were about to turn and exit when we saw a car entering. There's only one way to enter and exit the park, so we sat and waited. The car looked like one most older people might drive. I didn't think anything of it until I noticed it was driving very slowly. I began to feel uneasy as we waited for this car to pass, and it felt like it took forever. Since the bright lights were on, we could see the car and driver very well. To our surprise, it was an old lady. She had short white curly hair and very pale skin. She must have been in her 80s. The woman kept both of her hands on the steering wheel. What the hell was an old lady doing this far out of town at 2 in the morning by herself? She was facing forward and stopped her car in front of us before slowly turning her head to face us. This was the point where we froze. The woman's eyes were completely black. Then, just as slowly as before, she turned her head forward. She slowly turned right and drove off into the darkness to the furthest part of the park. I don't remember her headlights being on. We both got spooked and quickly left the park. I was confused by the whole situation. I have so many questions, but I'd rather not ask them. We lived in New Mexico, and we always hear stories of aliens and skinwalkers, but I don't know what that was. Perhaps it was a demon or even a devil. It has been 10 years since that happened, and I still think about it very often. A few months later, we drove out to the dirt roads to get away for a little bit. The sun was just setting. I knew we should have gone home as soon as it got dark, but I decided that we would park and relax. That's when we saw a humanoid figure that was dirty, had very long legs, and it ran on all fours. It ran into the field next to us, which I think was an alfalfa field, and vanished within seconds. I'm aware of many stories in New Mexico about skinwalkers, but I really never paid attention or believed in them. I figured it was a native superstition or the stuff you tell kids to make them stay in at night or give them a good scare. We mentioned what we saw a couple of times to some friends, and they too have stories about seeing weird things out by the dirt roads. We haven't been out driving like that in a while. However, it just seems dangerous. We are unsure if what we saw was a skinwalker or something else completely, but we've kept ourselves away from the state parks and the dirt roads, for the most part anyway. Some background information. I really love the summertime. I love hiking, being outdoors, and hanging with friends while camping and such. So during the summer of 2005, I was already starting to plan a little overnight camping trip in a national forest a couple of towns away from where I live. It is also important to mention that I do these types of things solo, and that this was my first time going with that specific national forest. I guess I was ultimately unprepared with this trip because while getting there, I had realized that I forgot to bring a ground cover for my tent, since I didn't use a tent with a built-in ground cover at the time. I also forgot some other small things, however. I was already more than halfway to the national forest, so I said F it and kept going anyways, since it was just going to be an overnighter. Things got worse when there was also a lot of traffic on the highway, throwing me a couple of hours off schedule. On my way there, I kept on glancing at the sky and looking at the sunset. Crap, I thought. It was already getting dark out. After 20 minutes of driving from the exit, I got to the mountains and there was nothing but trees on either side of the road. So not having been there before, I thought that I was already in the park. There was a moment I pondered how strange it was that there were no signs at the entrance, but already behind schedule and needing to set up camp, the thought disappeared as quickly as it came from my mind. After around 20 more minutes of driving through pure forest, and the road turned to gravel, I thought to myself, this has to be some sort of camping area, right? Looking back, I should have turned around there. But I was exhausted and a little stubborn by that point, so I was still dead set on finding some spot to camp. I finally settled on parking near a clearing on a dirt path and set up camp there. When I got out of my truck, things seemed fairly normal. The only thing that seemed out of place at the time, that there was no other sounds except for the crickets and the sound of me setting up camp. No wind, no frogs, owls, not even the howl of a wolf, just the crickets and myself. It was already getting late by that point. It was a little past 9, so I had dinner, sat around the campfire for a little bit, and then crashed in my tent. I awoke at 11:15. I thought I had woken up because my back was stiff and due to me sleeping on the bare ground, but my back seemed fine. I came to the conclusion that I had woken myself up randomly, and so I tried to go back to bed. Soon after closing my eyes again, I heard what sounded like a deep, raspy not far in the distance. That was presumably what had woken me up initially. I sat up immediately. Now what in the hell was that? I murmured to myself, since this didn't seem like the howl or growl of any animals I knew about. I went back to my sleeping bag, desperately thinking of myself of a logical explanation as to what made that sound. Maybe it was an owl being killed by a wolf or something, was what I concluded. After around 2 minutes of trying to fall back asleep, I was immediately jolted straight awake by that same shrieking sound right next to the wall of my tent. In pure shock, I immediately jolted up, bust out the front of my tent and ran straight in the opposite direction of what I heard. I didn't look back, and I also was unable to catch a glimpse of what it was. I was running for a couple of seconds when I slipped down a hill and tumbled for a couple of seconds until I stopped. I tried to keep as still as possible. Maybe the thing didn't see me fall, I thought. I didn't want to give away where I was. I listened closely, but there was no sound. I waited a little longer, still nothing. I peeked over the hill, trying to see as much of my campsite as I could in the pitch darkness. I didn't see any of it. While doing this, I noticed how there were no crickets chirping anymore. Pure silence. I didn't hear any leaves crunching either. To me, it seemed to be all clear that I could make a beeline for my tent, grab my pack, which had some miscellaneous stuff in my wallet in it, but most importantly my keys, and hightail it out of there. I knew I had to make this quick, so I tried to get to my car as quickly as possible while making the least amount of sound. I eventually got my keys from my bag, at which point I went over to the car, unlocked it, and turned the car on. Once I did this, I started to floor it out of there. I knew I shouldn't have done what I was going to do next, but I took one last look back at the tent. Crouching down, right beside the tent was the thing. Even in the darkness, I could make out its features. Its eyes were completely black, its body was covered with short white hair, and the overall body structure was barely that of a human. I knew it saw me because I saw it. The creature let out a screech that I'm all too familiar with now. I punched the gas pedal on my car and didn't stop until I got to a hotel a good distance away from the neck of the forest. I must have looked like a backwoods insane person or something when I came into the lobby all dirty in my pajamas. But I still got a room and immediately collapsed into the bed, exhausted. I had a nightmare that night where I was looking at myself in the third person, sleeping in my motel room, and the creature appeared at my window slowly before letting out a horrific screech. I jolted awake to the sound of nothing but my own heavy breathing and the crickets outside. I might be paranoid, but I'm fairly certain that at one point, that night, I heard the same screeching again, off in the distance. This happened to me a year ago on a camping trip with my dad in late July or early August. It was a weekend trip and we were the only ones at the campground. For privacy purposes, I will not state the name of the park we were camping at, but I will say that it was in the state of Indiana. Anyway, I was awoken with a start one night in my tent. Checking the time on my phone, it was around 3:30 a.m. I was hesitant at first to get out of the tent, but my bladder was screaming, which forced me to get out of the tent. The sounds of the forest I would have had any other time found comforting, but this time, for whatever reason, they seemed to unnerve me. About 50 yards away, and uphill, was a porta potty, and since I am a girl, I can't just pee in the woods, so I grabbed the headlamp which my mom had loaned me, turned it on, and headed to the porta potty. I was talking to myself in an attempt to calm my nerves, mostly because I was complaining about my bladder, and how dim the headlamp was. The light was so faint that it only illuminated 5 feet in front of me, so I ended up relying on the light of the moon to guide me. I made it to the porta potty without incident, relieved my bladder, and then headed back to the tent. Once I was around halfway there, it struck me. The forest was now silent, eerily silent. My mind began imagining the horrors of what was lurking in the woods. Skinwalkers, Wendigos, Bigfoot, who were just waiting for me to get in range so they could snatch me up and make me their dinner. With the speed of an Olympic runner, I sprinted the last 20 yards back to camp faster than anyone's ever seen. The headlamp died almost as I got there. Upon arriving at camp and catching my breath, I got the sensation I was being watched. I turned to face the tree line that bordered the lake and saw a pair of large yellow golden eyes. My tent is very close to this tree line, so whatever this thing was less than 15 feet away. Frozen in fear, I stared back at the eyes, then my headlamp went out. But the eyes of this creature were still glowing. I am a rational person, so I first figured it was a coyote or a large stray dog, and my headlamp's light was just reflecting off the eyes, giving the illusion that they were glowing. So when my headlamp went out, I expected the eyes to do the same. However, they did not. They were indeed glowing a golden yellow. Terrified, I took a few steps back and lost my balance, falling onto my butt. The eyes got closer, and the moonlight shone on this monstrosity of a creature, revealing a silhouette that in no way matched the size of a coyote or a dog. It was far larger and appeared to be on its hind legs. If I had to guess, the creature stood taller than 6 feet and had a hunched over body. It had the head of a dog. If I had to guess, it looked like the head shape of a husky or a wolf dog. Now, I know most people, when they talk about encountering dogmen, they mention a strong feeling of malevolence coming from the creature. For some reason, I think I felt the opposite. The eyes of the creature did not seem to hold any sort of malice or seemingly intent to harm me. Rather, I got the sense it was curious, or at the very least confused. After engaging in a staring contest with this creature, which probably lasted just about a minute, but felt like forever, the creature got back to all fours and retreated into the forest. But it made no sound as it did so. Was it Dogman or a werewolf or whatever you want to call it? I don't know. I know it wasn't a bear. We don't have grizzlies in Indiana, and black bears aren't all that common. I'm honestly at a loss as to what this creature was. It left no tracks behind in the muddy banks of the lake. If any of you know what it could be, please comment down below letting me know. I was backpacking in Arkansas, the Eagle Rock Loop in the Washita National Forest. There's a section of the trail that goes through an area called the Albert Pike Recreation Area. In June of 2010, a flash flood killed 20 people, including men, women, and children. There's a ton of stories online about this event if you want to look it up. So I start my trip at Little Missouri Falls, going counterclockwise. It's 26 miles with some pretty good climbs. You can find a map of the loop on Google Images. So I hiked a fairly long day. If you Google Eagle Rock Loop map, you will find a basic sketch map, not the topo map, just one of the basic ones with the labels of the trails, mountains, and water crossings on Pinterest. At the bottom of the map, there is a single water drop with a yellow circle around it. This just means it's always a wet crossing. There are several yellow circled water drops. The single one at the very bottom right next to the Viles Branch Trail. That is exactly where I was camped, so anyone can go there if you want to look it up and see what I'm talking about. So, that is the Little Missouri River. The water is flowing away from Albert Pike. I'm maybe 4 to 5 miles downstream from where the flash flood occurred. I don't know if this is significant or not to my story, but I'm not ruling it out either. I set up camp at about 4 p.m. for the day. This was November of last year. Fairly cold nights. It was about 26 degrees the night before. I was expecting another cold night in the high 20s. Not a lot of movement around there that night when it was cold. Most animals hunker down. I use a tarp where both ends are open. I have an inflatable sleeping pad and my 35-degree sleeping bag. Now, I'm set up on completely level ground. On my pad, on the tarp inside my sleeping bag, I quickly fall asleep around 10 p.m. after sitting around the fire. Everything is normal all evening, and all night for the most part. Now, you know when you're asleep and you fall in your dream? You get that sensation like you're falling in real life when you tense up and always wake up on impact. Okay, well I was asleep and I get the sensation sort of where I feel like I'm being dragged out of my tarp by my feet. Except it wasn't by my feet, I was being pulled by my sleeping bag. Like my whole pad with me in it suddenly being dragged out quickly. I woke suddenly as it startled me. Keep in mind, it was really cold, low 30s to high 20s at this point, and I have a 35-degree sleeping bag, so I'm inside my bag all the way with the top closed off by a shock cord. I'm completely inside my bag covered to stay warm. Now, I'm wide awake and listening for any movement. Everything is still and quiet, except for the river next to me, obviously. That is the only sound I can hear. I didn't peek out my head. I just laid there awake and listening. I sat there for a good 15 minutes listening for any sound outside of the river. I never heard anything. Granted, the river is pretty loud being right there, but there was no movement around my camp at all. So I chalked it up to having that falling sensation when you dream. I figured I must have been dreaming about something and it made me feel like that I fell or something. I went to sleep for 30 or 45 minutes longer, still keeping my ears open but figuring I was probably just dreaming. So for the most part, I just shrugged it off and put my mind off of it and got back to sleep. Morning comes and I get up and put my shoes on and roll out of bed. I head straight over to the fire to pit it and stoke at the fire for first thing because it's definitely cold outside at 6:30 a.m. this morning. I turn back towards my tarp and head over to get my food hanging close by. That's when I noticed it, and I froze. My pad and sleeping bag at the foot end are sticking out from under my tarp, by a good 1.5 feet at least. I can think about how now, as I felt being dragged out from under my tarp the night before, staring at how my bed is from under the tarp. I slowly approach the tarp and look for any sort of footprints. The problem is I don't even see my own because the ground is so compact around there. I double check and I'm not in any sort of slope at all. The ground is completely flat. I really have no idea how this happened, and I know I was startled awake by that sensation of swiftly sliding down the hill towards my feet. My pad with me in it was being dragged out. I quickly had breakfast, packed up and headed out. I was supposed to spend one more night on the trail, but the longer I hiked the more I thought that what would happen the next night. These thoughts running in my head the entire day as I walked. Could it have been another person? I didn't hear anything. Why would anyone do that to anyone else? How could I have slid down so far? Maybe it was an animal. It couldn't have been. There were no punctures in my mattress and there were no footprints anywhere. Did I just slide throughout the night with restless sleep? It doesn't make any sense. I normally sleep on a slight incline, and I've never slid outside of the tarp before. Was this paranormal? I'm not far from Albert Pike. Could this been some sort of ghost trying to save me from a flash flood horror that it was reliving over and over? All day long, The same things were running through my head. I ended up hiking to my car and sleeping in there that night. The Athens Big Fort Trail was very tough going up over 6 mountains. It was almost dark after I descended the last one. I hiked the last 3 or so miles by headlamp in the dark. I wasn't keen on sleeping on the trail another night after that. Truth is, I've been on that trail a ton and will for sure go back. I've been all over Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Mexico, and Colorado. Around 750 miles and countless nights spent in the woods all over the place. I almost exclusively hike solo. I never carry a gun or bear spray. I don't carry a SAT phone or GPS transponder. That is the only weird and unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me regarding camping, backpacking, and the outdoors. I went to a summer camp when I was younger, and every summer at the camp there was a 4-way long camping trip in the nearby national park. I decided to go on it, and our first day we canoed for almost 7 hours into what seemed to be the middle of nowhere. It was a couple hours before dark when we decided to make camp, and we pulled into a tiny bay and disembarked. One of the other kids in our group, there were about 10 of us campers and 4 counselors, immediately decided to head into the woods to collect some firewood, while the rest of us set up the site. Not 2 minutes later, he came sprinting back, shouting that he found a few people in the woods in huts and teepees. I remember laughing along with everyone else. He was sort of a goofy guy, so we thought he was full of shit, until we noticed how serious he still was, so most of us decided to investigate. We slowly made our way through the dense forest, and less than 200 feet from the campsite was a clearing with people milling about. Set up in the clearing were actual teepees, along with a few huts made of branches. At the back of the clearing was a bunch of pickup trucks, and behind them was a dirt track leading away. And not 15 feet in front of us as we emerged from the woods was a huge table with probably 40 people sitting at it. They stopped and stared at us, and we stared back. Then this small, older woman with a feather in her hair stood up. She smiled and offered us some food. Our head trip counselor politely declined, then asked if it was okay if we were camping nearby. She said it wouldn't be a problem, and already the other people were getting back at their huge meal. She sat down and we turned and headed back to the shore of the lake. We were all pretty stunned that we were going to be staying the night a few steps away from a lot of random strangers in the woods. But the counselor said it would be fine and finished setting up the camp. We all turned in pretty early though. Now that I'm even older than those counselors were, I don't think I would have had the balls to stay there through the night. The next morning we got up really early and we were getting ready to leave. Suddenly, a voice called out from the woods. The old woman from the table stepped out and asked if any of us had seen her husband. Now, none of us knew who her husband was or what he looked like, and considering we had interacted with these people for less than a minute, it was pretty weird that she would come over to ask about him. Also, I swear this is total truth, she was holding a huge knife. I remember we were all very still, and one of the counselors said we hadn't seen him. She turned and left, and we hauled ass out of there. It wasn't until we got to the next lake that the counselor in my canoe relaxed and acknowledged and fucked up that had been. As if it wasn't enough, on the last night of the trip, I woke up in the pitch black middle of the night and stepped out of the tent. All 10 of us kids shared to go pee. When I was younger, I woke up to pee a lot, but it was the first time on this particular trip. As I started peeing, I heard rustling and noises, and then a short howl. We were camped on the side of a very narrow inlet and extended far back in the main lake, and in the darkness on the side of the inlet you could see glowing eyes. I have almost never been scared, but I bravely finished peeing and slowly, yes slowly, went back into my tent. I'm not religious at all, but that was one and only time that I felt legitimately prayed for those wolves that they didn't come over the water or around us. Sorry for the length of the story. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to hit that thumbs up button as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss another video, as I upload videos like this and all things natural and supernatural almost every single day of the week. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.